Thanks a lot for having me. This is a great initiative, especially for those of us who are new members, because we get to meet a bunch of people, so that's nice. Yeah, so I'm Mona Simion. I work at the University of Glasgow. I'm a professor of philosophy, and I'm running this ERC project that has to do with how we gain knowledge from social sources, very roughly. And now we have reached work package 2, which means that we are now concerned with how we gain knowledge from other people, so what we call testimonial justification. And in the process of looking into this, we are concerned with 2 kind of directions. The first direction is the direction of disinformation. So we're concerned with people who are too gullible, with how we should protect ourselves from bad information coming our way, how we should reject bad information, but also we are concerned with resistance to reliable evidence, like reliable scientific testimony, for instance. So it turns out that as cognizers, in the social world, we have 2 vices. Sometimes we are too gullible, we believe everything that other people say, but sometimes we resist proper, reliable scientific testimony. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So the paradigmatic cases are going to be things like, climate change deniers and vaccine hesitant cognizers. I'm just going to work with these paradigmatic cases. So what this work does now, so I'm gathering this work in a book, hopefully that's going to be out next year, called Resistance to Evidence. And what the book does is it develops a full account of what is wrong with evidence resistance. So what is going on when we do that impermissibly, as it were. So there is a bunch of work on this topic, but not in philosophy. The work that is most known has been done in social psychology by people like Dan Kahan and colleagues. So according to Dan Kahan, polarization over questions of fact is a signature feature of contemporary political life. And what that is about, fact polarization, is a persistent polarized disagreement over facts that admit of scientific evidence, right? So we have these facts, we have a lot of evidence that suggest those are facts. So they're actually happening, but nevertheless there's a lot of polarization over these issues, which is a bit strange given that these are facts that have so much evidence to support them. The Pew Research Center also released a report that suggests that many Western countries appear to be experiencing deepening political polarization, including fact polarization, right? So if there's a lot of disagreement over a matter of fact that is so well supported by scientific evidence, clearly one of these groups is wrong. And the group that is wrong is the group that is resisting all of the scientific evidence. And the question is why, right? So the very popular hypothesis in social psychology is that the source of this problem is a failure to update our beliefs due to politically motivated reasoning, right? So what this hypothesis basically says is that when I believe that climate change isn't happening, and I'm confronted with evidence that it is actually happening, because I don't want that to be the case, I don't want to believe that it's happening, I resist this evidence independently of their force, independently of how clear this evidence is, right? And the thought is that this is an instance of motivated reasoning. So I do that because I don't want to believe this, right? So it's a reasoning that's, instead of being based on truth, kind of related factors, is based on desires, right? So it's the kind of reasoning that we engage in when we really want to, for instance, we're sick and we really want to get better, and because we wish we get better, we start believing that we get better, and that actually is usually helpful. Well, this is a bad instance of motivated reasoning, where because we really don't want it to be the case that climate change is happening, we also refuse to believe it, right? And that's motivated reasoning in general, but politically motivated reasoning has to do with political identity protection. So if I'm a left-wing individual, I want to protect my political identity. Part of my political identity is to believe that climate change is happening, that vaccines are good. And if you present me with evidence against that, I'm just going to reject it. Similarly, if I'm a right-wing individual, part of my identity is to argue that climate change isn't happening and vaccines are bad. So whenever you present me with evidence to the contrary, you're basically attacking my political identity. So I'm going to resist it because of that, right? So most interestingly, according to this hypothesis, the problem transcends epistemic classes, in that it is not the case, as media would want us believe, that if you're more educated, you're more likely to act rationally when presented with evidence, while if you're less educated, you're more likely to, base your beliefs on fears and superstitions. But to the contrary, according to this hypothesis, we are, first of all likely to do this, to resist evidence that goes against our political identity, no matter whether we're well educated or not, no matter whether we're right or not. That doesn't really make any difference. Furthermore, those of us who are better educated are actually more likely, according to this hypothesis, to be even more resistant to evidence, because we're better educated, we are better at arguing, and because we're better at arguing, we're better at arguing ourselves into the beliefs that we want to have, as it were. Right. So the proposed solution is quite unfortunate in that the only thing that they could discover as a solution is fostering curiosity as intellectual virtue. They discovered that more curious people are more likely to be more open-minded when it comes to evidence. Now, why is that unfortunate? Because it's really hard. I mean, fostering an intellectual virtue takes years, because we are talking about changing, intellectual character here, not just a belief or another, right? So the good news is that that there are very serious problems with this hypothesis, in that the experiment is set up such that it cannot discriminate between motivated reasoning and epistemically justified reasoning. What that means is just normal, permissible, evidence-based reasoning. Why is that the case? Well, because the identity data that they appeal to is also strongly correlated with previously held beliefs in the relevant topics. So I am left-wing, but I also have very strong beliefs that guns are bad. And these beliefs are mine, are justified, they're based on evidence, right? So I've seen environments where guns are legal, having a lot of gun violence, and environments where guns are not legal, having less gun violence. So I have some evidence that supports these previous beliefs of mine, right? And if you set up the experiment only to test correlation between my political identity and my resistance to evidence that suggests that guns are good or something like that, you're not going to be able to track whether I'm resisting this evidence because of my political identity that I'm trying to protect, or just because I have previously held beliefs about guns being bad that are well justified with previously had evidence. So it may well be that when you present me with evidence that actually there might be something good about them, I'm just rejecting this evidence because it is outweighed by the evidence that I already have, which suggests that guns are bad. And the experiment can't tell the difference. So that's a problem with this experiment. So here's an alternative hypothesis. Our alternative hypothesis is that resistance to evidence is actually often rational. It is often the result of proper Bayesian updating. That just means that often we have a lot of previous beliefs based on very good evidence, and that's why we reject this incoming evidence. Why is this a better explanation? Well, first of all, it's simpler in that it has more prior plausibility, in that we don't need to stipulate widely spread irrationality in the population. We should, we should always be suspicious of hypotheses that need to stipulate widely spread irrationality in the population, because we are quite good cognitive systems, us humans. We've done well in life because we are such good cognitive systems, right? So what we need is basically to look out for this distinction between bad evidence resistance, right? When we resist it for a bad reason, like motivated reasoning or something like that, because we just don't want to take up, and just justified evidence rejection because we have some previous evidence that suggests that this incoming evidence is not very good, right? And this distinction warrants very different interventions. That's why it's important. So if it turns out that we are all irrational, like the PMR hypothesis would have us, we need a lot of change. As Dengehan was suggesting, we need to train people into cognitive virtues. It's a lot of work, right? However, if it turns out that we have some people who believe, for instance, that climate change isn't happening just because they're surrounded by a bunch of people that tell them that it isn't happening, people people who are otherwise very reliable testifiers that never lied to them in their life, then they are justified to believe what these people say. Their belief is false. Climate change is actually happening. But if they are in an epistemic bubble, as it were, where everybody tells them it's not happening and they don't have any other information, these people are actually acting rationally when they believe it's not happening. And in that case, the good news is that we don't need to go and train them into cognitive virtues. All we need to do is to flood their environment with evidence to the contrary, which is much easier, and it's a one-off intervention, right? So again, previously held beliefs by people can be either epistemically justified, i.e. based on evidence, or unjustified. If they're justified, that can be justified true, like for instance, my belief that climate change is happening, right? From induction from many instances, right? For instance, my induction that gun control is a good thing, that suggests that gun control is a good thing, or they can be justified false, right? Like for instance, the case that I gave you with the climate change denier who's just surrounded by otherwise reliable testifier that tell him that on this particular occasion lied to him, right? So these are all justified beliefs. If they're justified, all we need is to flood the environment with the right kind of evidence. So that's great. But then also going to be the unjustified beliefs, right? So they're also going to be the people that Danke Han is talking about, who are irrationally rejecting this evidence, maybe for political identity protection, but not only, it might also just be a mistake. They might also just, for instance, appreciate the high risk of forming a particular beliefs as being higher than it is, right? Or think, well, there's a bit of disagreement about climate change, therefore I should withhold belief, which is a mistake because the disagreement is very minor. The vast majority of scientific testimony suggests climate change is happening. So they might just be making a mistake that need not be politically motivated reasoners. But the point is that we need an account that distinguishes between these two options, between rational people and irrational evidence rejection, in that we need an account that tells us what is going epistemically wrong in the unjustified cases. And that's what we've done. I'm not going to go into the details of the technical account. We, on our account, evidence plays the role of knowledge indicator, in that a fact is evidence for something insofar as it increases the evidential probability for the cognizer, and the cognizer is in a position to know this fact, which also gives us the result that unjustified climate change deniers and vaccine hesitant cognizers are a type of cognizer that's equipped with the right kind of cognitive processes. So to take up this fact, this evidence that's lying around them that climate change is happening, but they fail to take them up. So why is this account useful? Well, because it tells us what kind of cognizer we need in order to get proper irrationality, to discover proper irrationality. We need someone whose evidential basis supports climate change is happening, but they refuse to update their belief, right? Which excludes people who are, for instance, in a village surrounded by a lot of misleading evidence that suggests that it's not happening. Misleading evidence is still evidence, right? So this account that we've developed is going to be able to distinguish between these two types of cognizers, and the practical upshot of this is going to be that we need to basically look into these communities to figure out whether we have unjustified cognizers, in which case we need all this complicated virtue training, or we just have justified cognizers who are just surrounded by a lot of misleading evidence, in which case all we need to do is flood their environment with the right kind of evidence. And that's what we've been doing. We've started off now to working with with Public Health Scotland, just to try out our hypothesis. And we've been looking into Black communities in Scotland that have been quite vaccine resistant. There's a huge difference in uptake between white and Black communities in Scotland. And we've indeed discovered that for the most part, they have what we would call good reasons for believing that vaccines are very risky. And by good reasons, I just mean reasons that even though lead them to a false belief, they're the kind of reasons that they are justified to base their beliefs on. So what we should do is just bring more evidence in these communities in order to outweigh the reasons to resist vaccines. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mona. Really, really fantastic. Super interesting. This is also my field. So I was very, very interested in this talk. But before I flood you with questions myself, do the others here have any questions?
Maybe I do have a question. So you were talking about political identity a lot. right? And my question is, what does determine political identity?
Well, the way in which it is taken to be kind of built by researchers in this field is supposed to be something that's socially constructed. So basically, my political identity is going to be made out of a bunch of social norms that I endorse, right? So I endorse the norm. One shouldn't believe that climate change is happening, and one shouldn't, allow abortions to happen, and one, shouldn't take a vaccine, and one shouldn't wear a mask. That's a right-wing American political identity, for instance, right? So that's just a very rough picture. And if you, to the contrary, I endorse norms like we should all be free to do whatever we want with our bodies, and we should all wear masks to protect others, and so on. That's a left-wing political identity. So it is norm constituted in the way in which, in general, social entities tend to be norm constituted. So that's the assumption in the literature, which is why the thought is that when you have evidence that comes and suggests that what you believe, this kind of norm that says we should believe that climate change isn't happening, when you have evidence that suggests otherwise, you're going to resist it, because it not only attacks a belief that you have, it attacks a belief that is constitutive of who you are as a political beast, as it were.
Mm, mm. Super interesting. Do you think that this discussion that you're having, Mona, do you think it holds? I mean, I can see how that fits very neatly into an American context, for example, where it is quite clearly set into two camps, right? And then they almost they find if there's a new emergent issue, they rush to kind of take a position on it and then split it. Do you think it holds in, for example, in Scotland or in Europe?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So that's indeed, so one reason for why we're motivated to do this research is because this is so American specific that it's just very hard to tell how it would apply on the continent, right? I mean, in Britain, it would still apply. Britain is pretty close to America in terms of, political bipartisanism. But on the continent, it's very hard to know how it would apply. But we still have people who, reject vaccines, who, reject the thought that climate change is happening. And it's very hard to understand if all you have is this political identity protection type of hypothesis. It's very hard to understand why these people do it. And I can tell you that Black communities in Scotland is really not about their political identity. They are genuinely misappreciating the risk of the vaccines, and they're misappreciating it because of other type of misleading evidence in their environment based on some religious beliefs that they've got that suggest that it's better to leave it up to God rather than take a foreign substance and put it in your body. So they have a bunch of other beliefs that have very little to do with political identity that lead them to believe that the vaccine is much riskier than it actually is. So indeed, you're right. That was, I think, one of the main mistakes of assuming this hypothesis. It was a very American type of hypothesis to have, because political identity is not that divided elsewhere.
And sorry, I wanted to ask one more quick thing before we move on. What about you kind of saying one way we can kind of get beyond this is by either kind of maybe helping people to become more curious and take a more kind of balanced or nuanced approach and find evidence rather than getting locked in to a particular standpoint, or to kind of flood them with evidence. But I was thinking of the COVID case actually, where politically, I think you started to get some kind of strange new alliances, or you started to have people who would particular social groups that would not normally agree on very much, but might agree on the fact that, I don't know, the particular measures being taken by a certain government were not in the best interest of, I don't know, public liberties or whatever it might be. And so you started to have these kind of ultra left and ultra right groups or whatever getting together. So I wonder if that's not an interesting case or a kind of an outlier case, because in some ways it happened so fast that suddenly you had all these alliances cobbled together quite quickly.
Yeah, that's right. That's very helpful indeed. So if you know, I mean, anti-vaxxers used to be hippies, right? So that's what those are. I mean, you know, all of my hippie friends back home are anti-vaxxers. So, and you know, they're artists and so on. They're extremely left-wing, right? And now they're, as you say, just you know, cuddled up together in this anti-vax movement with the most right-wing people back home. So it's a very strange composition of these groups, which does suggest that, you know, political identity cannot be it, right? Because one thing, I mean, you know, if for any left-wing person, if it were to be about political identity, you should reject anything that the right-wing people like. So even if you liked it before, so, you know, if you cared about your political identity as a left-wing person, as soon as someone who's very right-wing endorses something, you should just abandon it. I think that's if that's all you care about, right? But that's not what we see in the population, right? The classic hippie anti-vaxxer continues to be an anti-vaxxer, even though now that puts them in the same group with very far right people. So indeed, that's another, thanks for mentioning that. It's very helpful. That's another counterexample of the politically motivated reasoning hypothesis.
That's very interesting.